Hello and welcome to this Elephants Don't Forget webinar, where we discuss with subject matter experts and leading authorities the key issues that are impacting and affecting regulated firms. I'm Philip Allen and delighted to welcome you to the 60-minute webinar on duty calls complying with the high standards of consumer protection here. Well, the FCA hasn't disappointed. The second industry-wide consultation paper on a new consumer duty may have closed last week, but the publication's words and expectations for, and I quote, a significant shift in culture and behaviour are reverberating around the sector. The impact of this publication cannot be underestimated in terms of its regulatory intentions, and some firms will need to work hard to carefully consider how the new requirements apply and impact on their own business. I'm delighted to be joined by our panellists here, Adrian Harvey, CEO of Elephants Don't Forget, Jonathon, Crook, Daren Allen and Geoff from Shoosmiths, Jeff Abbott of To Be Development Consultancy, and Nick Dent from the SMCR technology provider Worksmart, who will highlight the key messages from the regulator's 243-page consultation paper and the considerations your firms will need to develop business models, products and services, supporting processes and procedures that provide due consideration to your customers. And certainly we've got a packed webinar and we would love you to engage with what we're saying through our polls and also your questions that we want to make sure that we manage throughout the 60 minutes that we've got together. And also we'll send you a copy of the recording along with a copy of the slides by the end of the week. And don't forget to subscribe to all our regulatory updates and our thought leadership provided by each of the respective organisations on this webinar. We're going to cover 4 issues. Number 1, which is the new duty, what that means for you and for your firm and your customers as well. The challenges of senior managers, how they're going to evidence for good consumer outcomes expected by the regulator. The key elements of consumer duty through the lens of T&C. And finally, and importantly, how the FCA will enforce the duty. Lots to cover off. I know, but so keep your questions posted to us. But I thought we'd kick off considerations, and panelists, if you can unmute your microphones for this, because I'd love you to get your thoughts and insights into our first poll question, which is basically just asking you, how are you getting on so far? How are you considering the new consumer duty, and what preparations have you made for the new consumer duty so far? We've got a number of different options. Number 1, assembling a project team. 2, prioritising the areas with the biggest impact that the new consumer duty potentially may have. Have you secured board sponsorship for this project? Or given careful consideration to the costs and the impact and the implications from a compliance perspective? Have you considered training your new staff, or training staff on the new requirements? Or reviewing your current firm's approach to MI around new customer outcomes there? It'd be lovely to hear what your thoughts and feelings are on this. Whilst you're populating that, Jonathon, can I just jump in and come straight to you? Why is there a need for this new consumer duty? What's the raison d'etre behind the regulator's intentions over this?
Well, the main rationale is that in the FCA's view, firms are not consistently and sufficiently prioritising good consumer outcomes, and they've been influenced by the Financial Lives summary, that a survey that they did in 2020, which revealed low levels of confidence in the honesty and transparency of firms involved in the provision of financial services and products. So this is about the FCA wanting to introduce higher standards of care than those that currently exist, where firms are consistently placing customers' interests at the centre of their business. And in the words of the FCA, are putting themselves in the shoes of the customer. I think it's also about driving competition within the sector, and I think it's also about the FCA wanting to be able to look back in 3 to 4 years' time and be able to say we have transformed the way in which the financial services industry in the UK operates.
Mm-hmm. When we look at this as panelists, Daren, can I come to you first on this? When you see the top answer there, yeah, preparation for firms there, assembling a project team to conduct a gap analysis. Is this what you're seeing with clients at Shoosmiths now? 36% assembling a project team, 31% reviewing the appropriateness of the firm's current level and focus there. Is that what you're seeing?
Actually, I'm not seeing that, Philip. I'm looking at the poll with real interest, because at the start, none of the above we're still getting our heads around. It was was leading, and I think my experience, and it's only anecdotal because it's simply the people that I'm speaking to in the market. But my sense is that everyone knows it's coming, but that little work has actually started, which I think is not that surprising, given that the consultation document only really came, or the second consultation document came out in December, and the rules won't be finalised until July. What I am seeing, which is why I'm a little surprised about secure board sponsorship, because what I'm seeing is quite a lot of firms asking me to come in and speak to boards to outline the extent of the duty and the steps that need to be taken, and considering what I think will be a change programme. And I think I think senior management awareness and buy-in is going to be critical for a number of reasons, not least because of the budget. But it looks as though, from the poll outcome, that a lot of firms have gone down that road already and are starting to assemble a project team, which is actually very good news.
Yes, and Geoff, Abbott here, 12% training staff on the new requirements. Still early days for that?
Yeah, I think so, very much. That if we combine the two, just trying to get our heads around it and assembling a project team to do a gap analysis, you're not quite sure at the moment exactly what needs to be done. So I think the realisation will come further down the track that says there will be some training elements definitely required and changes to the way you do things. So I think that will come out as the projects develop.
Yeah, Geoff, Geoff May, can I come to you now? Consumer duty is a significant shift in expectation. Do you want to just give us the highlights of what that means for firms? Because I know that many firms probably are still getting their heads around it, as the poll suggested. So you just want to walk through some of the key highlights that we have on the screen.
Yeah, absolutely. What I'd like to do actually is start by explaining what it isn't, and it isn't TCF. And I think that's a really important message for regulated firms out there. For those of you who do TCF very well already, you might think we don't need to do a huge amount, because of course we are already serving our customers very well. Unfortunately, that's not really the case. This is a significant shift, and I'd say doing TCF well might just put you in a better starting point than a firm that isn't doing it well. And that's about it. In terms of what it looks like, the consumer principle sits at the top of all of this, and the FCA finally settled on the wording there, which is that a firm must act to deliver good outcomes for retail customers. I think we'll get into what good outcomes will look like a little bit more as we go along. The cross-cutting rules then underpin the principles and should be of particular interest to senior managers. And again, they've been scaled back slightly in the second consultation paper because the FCA removed the wording to take all reasonable steps to achieve the three things listed there. And so they have settled on those, act in good faith, avoid foreseeable harm, and enable customers to pursue their financial objectives. And finally, and very importantly, in terms of how you embed this within your firm, within your culture, is the four outcomes. These are said to represent the key elements of the firm-consumer relationship. And so it's really those four things: product, services, price and value, consumer understanding, and consumer support, that you will really need to look at in order to assess whether you're achieving positive outcomes, whether you're achieving consumer principle as worded. And as I say, I think we'll get a bit more into the detail about how you can do that as the webinar goes on.
And thanks for that. And certainly, Jonathon, I've heard this called TCF with teeth, or TCF on steroids here and there. And clearly, TCF hasn't shifted the dial, has it, in terms of to the expectation of the regulators. And hearing a lot more about outcomes-based regulation. For those people who are not unfamiliar with this, do you want to just unpack that in a bit more detail?
Well, I think the fundamental point is that going forward, if the language that is being used by firms is that of treating customers fairly, then the response from the regulator is going to be, you've completely missed the point. If you're still using that terminology, if you're still using that that as your guiding principle, then you have missed you've missed the fundamental objective here. And this is about being able to demonstrate to the regulator, to the satisfaction of the regulator, that you are delivering the requisite outcomes for customers, and that you have the data which enables you to demonstrate that to the satisfaction of the regulator. So the regulator will be much more proactive in going to firms and saying, prove how you have embedded these the principle into every element of the way in which you operate.
But I'm going to just challenge that through a number of conversations I've had with firms, and said, but we're doing this already, aren't we?
Well, that begs the question: what is it? And you then have to go to the rules, and you have to go to the outcomes and say, measured against those specific requirements, how confident are you that you are in fact meeting these requirements? This is about the imposition or about delivering higher standards. Are you confident that you are already operating to that to those higher standards? And I suspect that in many instances the FCA is not going to be persuaded that that is in fact the case.
Geoff, the FCA wants to focus less on meeting the letter of the rules, but more on outcomes for consumers. Do you want to talk us through what the expectations are?
Yeah, of course. I think that's an important point as well, because one of the criticisms, if you like, or the feedback to the consultation has been that everybody needs more clarity. But unfortunately, I don't think you're going to get it. The FCA does not want to simply have a set of rules which you can essentially, which enables you to just use as a tick box to say, yep, we comply with all of these, so we're fine. Again, it's all about outcomes, and that will differ from firm to firm. What positive outcomes look to you as a firm will be completely applicable to your products, your customer journey, and everything. So to pick up on a couple of those on the screen, innovation, for example, we live in an age where a lot of consumers, I should say retail clients, but that they want frictionless customer journeys these days. They want things very quickly. They sign up to financial services products using their mobile phones, so there's only so much information that can be put on one screen. At the same time, there'll be a number of firms who have to comply with disclosure requirements pre-sale, and there's almost a direct conflict there. So you have to think a little bit about, actually, is a little bit of friction in the customer journey a positive thing? Because if it means the customer has a better understanding of the product they're about to sign up to, then surely that means there will be a better outcome. And that may mean losing one or two along the way. But if the product was never suitable for them in the first place, then again, you'll be able to turn around to the FCA and say, well, we're well and truly complying with this because we are considering the outcomes for consumers and recognizing where, and this ties into the outcomes one there as well, and we're recognizing that this particular product isn't suitable for everybody. And that's something you can start thinking about now in terms of looking at your customer demographic, thinking about whether customers are really getting out from a product what they would have hoped for. And there is data you can start to collect in order to achieve that.
Yeah, and Daren, these are ambitious goals. Are these expectations from the FCA realistic? That flummoxed me with the question. And there, Geoff, do you want to pick that up on that?
Yeah, sure. Are they realistic? I think yes, I think they are realistic. I actually think that it shouldn't be an hour of doom mongering. I think that there can be a lot of positives can come from this. I think the biggest problem, which we'll come on to, is actually the implementation time and the lead-in time. But as a concept, I think most people would accept that there's nothing wrong with wanting to ensure customers receive good outcomes. It will require a bit of a shift in the way that firms think about doing that. And again, you're not going to get a list of rules to tick off from the FCA. What they have done is they've underpinned the whole thing with the common law concept of reasonableness. So really, again, think about your business, your product, and what is reasonable in the circumstances. And yeah, as I said, I do think it's completely realistic, but it will take longer to really become embedded in firm culture than the FCA has perhaps allowed.
Geoff, if I may, if you've got an online product, you could sort of think through how relatively easier that is to control the customer outcome. But if it's not an online product and it involves an interaction between an employee and a customer, that outcome is determined by the competence of the employee.
Yeah, absolutely right. And for that, I think training is crucial. And yes, the tone does have to be set from the top. The FCA has said that, but this has to filter down quite quickly. And when I say training, I don't just mean a very brief, again, tick box exercise. Once a year, we'll jump on an online session just so we can say we've trained all of our staff. That's not enough. I think it has to be continual. Something that will feed into that is monitoring outcomes and perhaps gauging, again, being more proactive with gauging from customers whether or not they think products are suitable for them and if they're working in the right way. And then you can probably identify the areas where you're falling short, if indeed you are, and where perhaps the training will need to be ramped up. But I think a lot of the training will need to be more tailored.
And Geoff, I mean, Adrian's absolutely right. It directly affects those people that do the customer facing stuff, but actually it has an impact right across the business, surely, because even if you've got an online platform, then those responsible for creating the content of that online platform, they have a responsibility too. So, I mean, it occurs to me it affects every function across the business. So it's going to ramp up a training and competence need across all functions within organisations.
Yeah. I feel I have to chip in there as well. That I think, yeah, you're absolutely right, Nick. It does affect more than the customer-facing staff. We talk about the customer journey and the touch points and all the people that are involved in that. So they all have to be exposed to, if you like, the brave new world, but training would have to be clearly tailored to their requirements. But the key here is it's like pieces of a jigsaw. Think about the behaviours. If we think about what Adrian was saying, the behaviours that are necessary to support this and the expectations that we place upon people so they clearly understand. Yes, some of it will be training, some of it will be how do we embed it, how do we monitor it. But it's also the linkage between the behaviours that you're looking for, the values that you uphold within your company and the culture that creates. So it's all interlinked.
Just to add to that, whether it's realistic or not, I mean, I think it depends on the nature of the firm and the products and the customers and delivery channels. But as an example, we at Shoosmiths have been doing an exercise for a provider looking at T's and C's over about 60 products, and the project is scheduled to last 2 to 3 years. So when you think that this is going to be in place in just over a year's time, whether it's realistic or not, it's not really the question, because the FCA would expect you to comply, but it's a real challenge for firms to ensure they can get their ducks in a row. And I think the key is going to be to ensure that you have a plan and that it's properly documented and audited, because I think if you show that you've started early and you've planned it out, I think the FCA is likely to be a lot more lenient on you than if you decide to look at it at the last minute.
Yes, worthwhile, Geoff, May, just touching base of who's in scope for this, so we just nail that down for organisations that are thinking, gosh, is this relevant to me? And if so, how is it relevant?
Yeah, sure. So some of this will actually follow on from parts of what we just discussed. But to start, forgive me because I did use the term consumers previously, when in fact the consumer duty applies to retail clients. So that is a broader definition. Again, ever so slightly scaled back in the second consultation paper. What the FCA has done is aligned it with the sectoral source books. So that definition, for example, for insurance customers, it would just align with the definition in the ICOBs, and likewise mortgage customers in MCOB. So in that sense it will remain, but it pretty much will apply to all products being sold to retail customers. I think crucially as well to mention is that it applies to the wider distribution chain, and this is what I mean about it following on from our discussion just now, in that it's not just a firm that needs to know what is required under the consumer duty. Of course, you're only really responsible for your own actions and the part that you have to play. But I think one of the areas that's causing a lot of angst at the moment is where you have a distribution chain, whether that's firms that are influencing the design, the distribution of products, or the product performance itself. They are also responsible under this consumer duty. And so where does their responsibility end and ours start, and vice versa? I think that's something that a lot of firms, in my experience at the moment, are struggling to get their heads around.
No, that's a good point there. Expectation on firms, Geoff, Abbott, are significant on there. Do you want to pick out one area, and then I'll go to you, Jonathon, afterwards, that you think that firms will have challenge executing?
Yeah, sure. I'm going to jump to the end point because I think it's really quite important we get this one. The FCA will consider how governing body reviewed. I think one of the keys to this whole exercise is to put yourself in a situation where if you're submitting the report to the board at the end of the day to demonstrate how as a company you're achieving good consumer or customer outcomes, it's how what information you're going to present. What does that look like? And how close are you to be able to produce that type of information? I think that's going to identify a number of gaps. And from those gaps, you can start to take actions to plug those gaps and identify the changes that you need to make. And it will help focus the minds as to what needs to be done.
Okay, Jonathon?
I think it comes back to the point that I made earlier in terms of the FCA's expectation on firms putting themselves in the shoes of the consumer. So being able to demonstrate that this is the product or service is in question is a product or service that directors, employees of that firm would happily purchase or invest in, and or would recommend happily to family and friends. I think that is the sort of litmus test for the FCA in terms of the delivery of good outcomes for consumers.
Yeah, Daren, you spoke before the webinar of unintended consequences.
Yes,
what do you mean by that?
Absolutely. Well, it's the third bullet down on the left hand side. I think the challenge of keeping on top of everything and monitoring each step in the customer journey is going to be huge for some firms. Just the speed in which you can deal with these things. And I've done worked with clients on a number of change programs, and as I said before the webinar, the real challenge is dealing with the unintended consequences. So you make a change in one area that has an impact on another area, and how do you monitor that? How do you look at that, and how do you deal with that swiftly to ensure that there's no detriment to consumers? And I think it's easy to say that you'll have a process to monitor and to change, but actually I think it's going to be really difficult to implement in practice.
Daren, we were talking about that before, weren't we? We were talking about breaking that change into two component parts, one of which was process, which you could think about how a small firm might have a big spreadsheet to do that, and a bigger firm would have a bigger headache. So there's process, certainly cause and effect and unintended consequences, but another component part is your people.
Yeah.
So
absolutely.
In order to know what's changed, you need to know where they are today. So you've actually got to have an accurate people competency map, yeah, and monitor that in relation to those changes.
You're absolutely right, and that has to dovetail in as well with all the other policy procedures about remuneration and incentivizing people and so on. That's going to be a real challenge for firms.
I guess it's an opportune moment as well, just to make the point that this is kind of a never-ending journey as well. So it's not a one and done type project. It is really reviewing those systems and controls that you guys are referring to, and embedding things that will take you into the future, become part of the way a business operates from a BAU point of view, and something they continually monitor and evolve.
Yes, nice segue. Thank you, Nick. We didn't set that up, but it's great segue into Geoff May, identification. What firms could be doing now around identification of products and services that they're offering, and how they could best align that with the expectations of the consumer duty?
Yeah, well, I think one of the things you could start doing is, as I said, reviewing your products in accordance with what the FCA expects from this. I mean, that in itself is a huge undertaking, and I think all of us now have pretty much touched on the short implementation period that you're going to get to do this. So just start as soon as possible to have a real think about your products, and not just whether they're suitable for customers, but also the journey itself. You know, what does that look like? How easy or otherwise is it for customers? Think about sort of endpoints, cancellation processes. Is it as easy to cancel a product as it is to enter into it? That's something the FCA has specifically referred to. You know, that all comes down, that all ties into this idea of good outcomes, because there could be many reasons why a customer wishes to cancel, and they don't want to have unnecessary hindrances in place. Look at your documentation. Are there key terms hidden away somewhere that actually customers would really need to be aware of, because it might impact their decision making? If there are, that won't be in accordance with the consumer duty. That's particularly important. And the other thing which we haven't really touched on much is vulnerable customers as well. You know, one risk area to all of this that has been flagged is that firms will actually narrow down their products.
Yes, I've heard that. Yeah.
Yeah, meaning that they may be perhaps which could actually have the opposite effect to what the FCA is hoping to achieve by limiting the number of products available, and therefore meaning vulnerable customers can't get the products that they need. So I think maybe consider it in the context of vulnerable customers as well. That runs throughout the consultation paper, and I think you need to have a good think about whether there's anything else you could do to support vulnerable customers. I think a lot of firms have actually shown that they are capable of doing that, because throughout the pandemic, of course, we've been having to deal with that, and many firms have really stepped up in that respect, and they've shown great forbearance, and they've been very supportive. And that maybe take the extra measures that you've used during the pandemic and now embed them into your processes for future use, and because that would be a good way of demonstrating getting good outcomes for your customers.
Yes, Nick, when we look at the expectation on technology here, and using business intelligence systems to monitor and track against key metrics that are relevant to consumer duty, and therefore the data that is thrown off those systems and processes using tech, I can't really see how you can monitor this from a compliance point of view without technology.
I would absolutely agree. You'd expect me to say that anyway, wouldn't you?
Yes, I would.
A technology provider. But look, we're in an environment where, I mean, the regulator is certainly ramping up their capabilities in terms of data and analytics. They're investing huge amounts of money. They're recruiting data analysts and really some quite capable people. So they're looking for patterns of behavior and indicators and that kind of thing. And I guess it's important to say as well that this doesn't affect just the traditionally risky sectors of the market. It actually affects everybody, because what the regulator is interested in is your potential to implement risk to your customer base. That's what it's all about. And with data analytics, they have the ability to monitor that in real detail, but across the whole sector, really. And from a RegTech point of view, I mean, I think the benefits of RegTech are broadly understood to be risk mitigation and operational efficiency. But I think what I see is many firms don't actually sit back and say, well, how could that benefit us? I mean, for example, I was only talking to a firm the other day at a conference that I attended. And we were talking about SMCR, and of course we have an SMCR solution, and they were explaining to me why they didn't need technology, because they had a team of people that spent all day on the phone chasing people down and making sure things were happening in a timely manner. And I had to kind of say, well, with respect, you've just told me exactly why you need technology, because you've got valuable people doing resource-heavy, resource-hungry processes, and reliant on maybe an inadequate set of evidence, the evidential records. So how confident are you with supplying the regulator with accurate, detailed records backed up by evidence? I think firms need to look at freeing up their resources to be able to come up a level, I think, and making sure they're doing things for the right reasons and the right outcomes are being delivered.
Yes, indeed. Adrian, when you hear what Shoosmiths are saying in terms of like the expectations from the regulator's point of view, training is going to be at the heart of understanding, your training staff are going to be at the heart of understanding customer behaviours, and even spotting perhaps potential biasness in product design, because they're going to get that direct feedback from the customer itself, and that customer expectation is going to be increasingly fluid, isn't it, as those expectations change, and therefore products and services will have to change, and therefore ergo training will have to change.
Yes, and if that's quite an interesting point, that last line you made, training will have to change. I wonder if we held up the mirror of truth as participants in this webinar and said, do we really think our training delivers competent and capable employees that can deliver against this requirement? And the evidence would suggest from our experience in this market is no, and that probably means that firms do need to take a more authentic approach to employee training and competence. Otherwise, and be able to monitor and analyze how that's landed.
Before we move on, I'd like to just pose the question to both Daren and Jonathon about this, and picking up on conducting a gap analysis on where should firms start on this, but also talking about tone from the top. We also talk about the regulators over the last 6 months been talking about tone from the middle as well as tone from the top. There, culture has a huge impact on this, and that's what they want to see. They want to see that, quote, significant shift in culture. Do you want to pick up on that and unpack that, and also look at where firms can start with this gap analysis?
Well, shall I? I'll just deal with the gap analysis point, perhaps, because it's perhaps easier said than done, because it's not a traditional gap analysis in the sense of looking at where you are now and where as a firm you want to be in 2 or 3 years' time. It's looking at where you are now and where the FCA will expect you to be at that point. And that is very difficult, I think, at this point in time to be able to assess. I think a starting point in relation to this, and perhaps going back to the poll questions, is: are you satisfied at the moment that you have allocated sufficient resource and sufficient budget to undertake the work that is likely to be required? But in terms of the gap analysis point, I think it also dovetails into the next point in relation to monitoring and analysing information. That they're two sides of the same coin, I think.
I think and then picking up on culture, I think, as I mentioned earlier, I think this is probably, for me at least, the most important first step. If you look at any financial, non-financial scandal in recent years, the root cause is very often governance related. strong executives not being challenged, a failure of committees to scrutinise issues, lack of accountability, failure, as you mentioned, Philip, to communicate to middle management, and so getting the culture right at the start and getting the governance structure right at the start is so important. And what do I mean by that? I think it's having, as we mentioned in one of the earlier slides, having maybe a steering group comprising of key stakeholders, training which is being mentioned of both board and senior management, and then cascading that down, and then having a proper change program. It sounds grand, but the size of it will depend on the nature of the firm, but something that's properly project managed with clear milestones, roles and responsibilities, so people know what they should be doing. Having that in place, I think, will provide a measure of protection in the event that the FCA come knocking in a year and a bit's time.
All this against the background, Geoff, May, of a 9-month, potentially so far, 9-month implementation. I mean, this is tough, and certainly some trade associations in the city are saying, you know what, we all want this to work, but is there enough a runway for this?
Well, it's a very fair question. It's a very good question, which I think a lot of people are grappling with. A lot of people are questioning. I know UK Finance came out recently and said it just is not long enough given how much needs to be done, and especially against the backdrop of a lot of firms still coming out of having dealt with the pandemic and the customer support that they had to put in place for that. So again, it takes you back to a question about whether it's realistic. I think the proposals are, but they're going to take a lot longer than 9 months to implement. And I guess all I can say, but please don't quote me on this, is that I hope the FCA will be understanding in that respect. And even if they do stick with the current implementation timeline, which I think they will, they at least recognise that not everyone's going to be 100% over this by and ready on day one. I think it may take a little bit longer.
Can I just make the point as well in relation to that, is that if you compare the implementation period with the implementation period that the FCA ultimately settled on in relation to operational resilience, consumer duty is far more wide-ranging in terms of its impact on the sector than operational resilience perhaps is, and to have a 3-year timeline for the former and then a 9-month timeline for consumer duty just seems to me to be putting an unfair burden on the sector. And I really do hope that that's an area where the FCA does have a rethink.
Isn't this perhaps the FCA saying this is how much importance we place? Because this is actually holistic legislation, isn't it? It's not a tick box. It's not like, I've done that, I've mapped my responsibilities. This is a piece of holistic legislation. So isn't this a really clear statement from the FCA saying culture is at the centre of what we want to do? And we're not going to give you a long period of time to do it. We're going to say it needs to be done in 9 months. And we want to see what actions you're taking to get yourselves there, almost accepting that you won't be there, but show me intent.
I think that's absolutely right. Sorry, I think that's absolutely right, Adrian. And also, as I mentioned earlier, I think if you've got a plan and you're working through it methodically and it's all sensible and proportionate, then I think the FCA. I don't anticipate the FCA will come steaming in on the day after. We've had examples in recent years of, for example, that the money laundering regulations came into effect on a Friday and they were effective from the Monday, and the FCA realised that people weren't going to be ready. But I think that expect firms to have thought this through and have a plan in process.
Daren, I just want to pick up what the regulator uses, the word assertive supervision. I'm mindful of the question that we've just had posed in the question and answer. If you could click on that as panelists there, that the burden of regulation for smaller firms is rather challenging. Some firms obviously are still making their preparations, their plans for op resilience for 31st of March. And now they've got to obviously do this as well as implementing risk and controls for other areas of the business. But when we talk about assertive supervision, what does the FCA mean by that?
Well, it's going to take many forms, I think. And sadly, in answer to that question, my experience is that often the smaller firms are easy targets and so there's a disproportionate focus on them sometimes, which I think is unfair, but that often is the way it goes. But I think what you'll see is, and I'm not saying this will happen on day one, by the way, because I think there will be a bedding in period, but assertive supervision, I think, will be FCA visits, file reviews, requests for documents. I've seen examples, not in the consumer duty context, but in other contexts, where the FCA have turned up at someone's premises and just simply demanded to see documents straight away. They're very much data led, as they've said. So there'll be requests for data, particularly I think around complaints data. We've seen, and I think we'll continue to see, variations of permissions. So those that haven't experienced this, there is the FCA has the ability to vary permissions on its own. Of its own volition, but there's also a VREC, which is a voluntary variation of permissions, which we've seen quite a lot in a number of recent fines. I can tell you now, there's nothing voluntary about it. You're told that the FCA would like you to accept a VREC, and if you don't, then they will use their own powers. Section 166 skilled person reviews, we're seeing that increase. I think you'll see that quite a lot. I think you'll see authorization interviews as well. So again, in other contexts, we've seen the FCA very keen to ensure that those people that are at the that are being authorized are appropriate individuals to be conducting the activity for which they're being authorized. And then potential redress schemes. So, the interest rate hedging product was a perfect example of that, and Dear CEO letters. So there's going to be a lot of stuff coming down the line in terms of guidance, in terms of what the FCA expect firms to be doing.
Daren, can I just pick up on a point about smaller firms? I'm sure Nick will support me. One of the things about smaller firms, I think I do agree. I think they are an easier target, but to perhaps balance that, it's far easier for smaller firms to implement reg tech solutions really quickly, than it is perhaps for enterprise scale operations.
Do you know what? I agree with that, subject to this caveat, and that is that sometimes firms can't afford the reg tech option. But when you were having that discussion early on, I was thinking that might be the case in relation to some firms, but in those cases, what they should be doing is having a very clear audit trail explaining why reg tech isn't the solution, maybe because they're way too small, or because it's simply not economical to employ it. But you're right. If it can be afforded, then that's quite a neat way of dealing with some of these issues.
Daren, listen, I think it's a cost of doing business. And if you're talking tens and tens of thousands of pounds per employee, it's clearly unaffordable for a small firm. But when you're talking perhaps a couple of £100 an employee, it's a nonsense argument. We can't afford it. Well, it's a cost of doing business in this market. Maybe you shouldn't be in this market.
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, I've seen it in relation to other areas where in terms of monitoring software for financial crime, and sometimes it's just not worth it. And you could argue that it's cost of doing business, but you're right. Firms need to carefully consider whether they should have it, and if they shouldn't, and if they don't have it, whether they should be in that market.
Yeah, I want to just talk about, because we can't talk about consumer duty without talking about embedding the consumer duty alongside SMCR requirements. Jonathon, can I just turn to you on that? You're a board member or you're a senior manager. What data sources and what MI are you expecting to be to have or to receive as a result of making sure that you can evidence good customer outcomes to the regulator?
Is Jonathon on mute?
Potentially. Anyone can pick it up. Daren, do you want to pick that up?
I was going to. I find it interesting that the FCA, I think some of the other panelists have got views on this as well, that have said that a measure of success is going to be a reduction in complaints, and I find that really interesting, because my experience is that that's not going to happen. I suspect that the introduction of the consumer duty is going to lead to more complaints, some justified and others not. I think you're going to find people who have actually got the outcome that they should have got, but they're not happy with that outcome, and they're going to complain and seek redress. So I think that's going to happen. I think you're going to see a huge increase in compliance costs because more resources are going to be required, and as we just discussed, potential fintech as well. So I think that's what you're going to see in practice.
Daren, what we saw in operation when I was running large utility businesses, when you put in place accurate methods of measuring, the things that you're measuring generally go up. Yeah. So from a health and safety point of view, when you actually start recording every single near miss, and doing it accurately, they go up. This isn't something that should be run away from. These are lead indicators of future significant problems. So the fact that complaints might go up should be embraced. Now at least I know the truth, and I can put my resources and allocate them appropriately rather than perhaps on a misinformation.
Do you know, Adrian, I think that's right to a point, but I'm a cynical lawyer, and I know there'll be claims companies out there that won't necessarily be looking for truth. They'll be looking to make a claim.
Are there other types of lawyers, Daren?
I'm sorry about the minor technical malfunction there, but just so you know, I'm still here, and I would entirely endorse the point that Daren made, and just going back to the point about there being perhaps leeway on the part of the FCA in terms of firms getting this right. I'm not sure you're going to see leeway on the part of CMCs. No. And although the FCA might be quite happy to allow firms time to get their house in order, as it were, once the consumer duty is in place, once the rules are in place, CMCs will be able to look at bringing claims in relation to breaches of those rules. And I'm pretty sure, as Daren says, that is what's going to happen. So if one of the metrics about achieving good consumer outcomes is reduction in complaints, then actually, in many instances, you are going to have a situation arising where volume of complaints increases, not through any fault on the part of the firm, but simply because an environment has been created in which those complaints can be made.
And the failure to comply with the new consumer duty has a high price, like this slide listed out. Geoff May, do you want to just pick up on the top left hand side, because I think that came through on the consultation, didn't it?
Yeah, it did. I mean, in many respects, not a huge amount to say now, other than that it should be a relief to everybody impacted by this, that the FCA is not introducing a private right of action. I think that caused a bit of uproar in the first consultation paper. Would have represented quite a significant shift. They've never had such a enforcement mechanism for one of the principles, and to do so would have been quite something, and certainly would have shook the industry even more than these wider proposals already have. So yeah, good. That's a good news story.
Can I just say that that's something where the FCA has done a handbrake turn, because they were originally consulting on introducing a private right of action for breach of the consumer principle.
That's right. Yeah.
Now they're saying there's no private action for breach of the consumer principles in the new Principle 12, or indeed any of the rules made. So that's different to the position that exists, say, under COBS, where there is a statutory cause of action for breach of a COBS rule. So whilst it's a relief that firms won't be vulnerable to legal proceedings in relation to a breach of the consumer duty, and that also means that Section 404 redress schemes and FSCS really don't arise. It really does link with this point about complaints to FOS, because that is going to be the recourse, and I think that you're going to see increasingly claims that arise in relation to other parts of the handbook being reframed as claims that arise under the consumer duty. Because in those circumstances, there won't be any basis for FOS to decline jurisdiction, because ultimately the consumer will not have anywhere else to go other than to FOS.
I would agree with that, Jonathon. Can I encourage panelists to look on the questions that were posted by a couple of people, Rob in the chat there, and
Just answering Rob's.
Okay, and Nick, looking at, I really do want to drill down onto the MI that board members were expecting to see around good customer outcomes. Maybe we could part that to the end as I give some time for panelists to discuss what that is. But we are talking about the increased compliance cost here. There is an expectation, even the FCA has mentioned some eye-watering figures about what that would do to implement this and to manage and maintain this. But as Adrian said, this is BAU, isn't it?
You're asking me the question. I was just typing the answer to Robert. Yeah, at one level you could say it's business as usual. I have a lot of empathy for where Robert's coming from. We run a small firm, Robert, and whilst we're not regulated by the FCA, we have a absolute duty to our customers to ensure that we maintain information security standards of the highest level. The costs to our business of doing so are astronomical. They're potentially doubling year on year. We have no choice but to comply with that if we wish to continue to deliver against the service or the security standards of our customers. But that is a shared responsibility. Any other firm, providing services into the market similar to ours, will have to bear those costs. So you ultimately it passes the cost on to consumers. So, well, therefore, the legislation is an ass because it's making things more expensive for customers. Yeah, possibly, perhaps, but it certainly will be a level playing field.
Geoff, Abbott, we can't leave this webinar without talking about the impact that consumer duty will have on training and competency. And I know you've done. Submitted a lot of blogs on this and also some workshops on it. Do you want to talk us through the impact of consumer duty on culture, conduct and competency, and obviously invariably the consumer? Okay. Everybody's gone silent on me. Geoff, are you there? Geoff Abbott? Okay, right. Do we want to pick up the questions? Maybe we can get.
No, I'm back. I'm back. For some reason, my machine decided to mute me, which was cheating. Yeah, you may be surprised to see why customer culture conduct is on a T&C slide. I think very briefly, the things to think about is the new consumer duty talks about the customer journey that contains a number of touch points. But from a T&C perspective, don't forget there's this rule within SIS that says if you've got people that are performing activities that aren't listed in Appendix 1 of the T&C sourcebook, you may wish to consider applying T&C to them as well. What that means in essence is that whilst you don't need a formal T&C scheme for everybody outside the Appendix 1, it's not a bad practice to do so. So how well are your sort of processes and procedures documented? And I suppose I'd link that to the senior manager's responsibilities and the guidance that says you do have to have the policies and procedures in place to review the competence and performance of people. So it's just something to think about on that side. The culture, yeah, the FCA keeps on going about the culture and how important it is to have a customer-centric culture. And as you have to ask yourself, how well is our culture understood within our firm? Is it truly customer centric? How about the values that underpin that? Because living those values is part of the ethical behavior you need to demonstrate competence. So there's the relationship there. The interesting one that I find with conduct, and this is the thing that talks about, are we just paying lip service to the rules? Everybody in this audience, I suspect, or most of the people in this audience are affected by the code of conduct. And the regulator's expectation at this precise moment is you should know what those 5 conduct rules are that affect you and how they affect your individual role. It's not about a piece of e-learning that you walk away from. This is all about embedding it. And they refer to the Cape Canaveral scenario, which I won't go into, I'm happy to, but the idea is how do you actually embed this? And with further changes in the code, you've got to think about that. What are you going to do differently to make sure that people understand the changes and how it affects their day-to-day job? And then finally, with the competence, and this is the key for me, is that we have to ask ourselves whether the competencies we look for, the behaviours that we expect from people have changed, have modified. And I think the big things there is how we deal with vulnerable customers, how behavioural economics has an impact on the jobs that we do. To understand how biases come in, or heuristics or asymmetries, whichever ones you want to look at. But have we actually done anything about not only understanding that, but understanding how it affects the job we do? Within the world of T&C, is how adept are the supervisors at picking up the traits of vulnerability so that the advisors, the sellers, have actually picked that up, or the accidental use, if you like, of behavioural economics that influences the buying decisions. So if that's the case, you may need to think about some of the training for your supervisors as well. But the bottom line is, it's all about behaviours, and getting those right, training them, measuring them, monitoring them. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, I would agree with that. So our next poll question is to say, what will be your key challenges in implementing the new consumer duty? You've heard from Shoosmiths, Elements, don't forget Worksmart, and consultancy there. Where do you think the pain points or the challenges might be on this? Is it gathering data, conducting a gap analysis? And whilst you cogitate on that, I just want to ask the panelists, how will a senior manager know that they are meeting the expectations of the regulator on consumer duty? Geoff May, what do you think?
It's a good question. I mean, fairly difficult to say at this stage, but I'd probably say that they're just going to have to have a kind of more proactive role in gathering that information, maybe not themselves, but at least have a process in place in order to do so, which enables them to take the time to look at it and think, are we achieving what we're setting out to achieve? So really, it's going to have to be, while they set the tone from the top, all of the data and the information that they need is going to have to go the other way and go up the chain to them in order to consider it. I think they're going to have to show the FCA that they are proactively engaged in achieving positive outcomes.
And Daren and Jonathon, are you surprised 48% of the audience saying conducting a gap analysis is one of the key challenges there, seconded by providing firms, your board and management, with the evidence required to meet expectation as the second answer? 40%.
No, I'm not surprised. I'm not surprised. I think that those do identify the real challenges, and in fact, I suspect.
In fact, Daren, you predicted that in the pre-chat when we were planning this. You said that's 1 and 2.
What I would say though is that it's perhaps looking at it from the wrong way in the wrong way to say, what do we need to do in order to provide our board or management with the evidence that we are complying? The initiative really needs to come from the board, and it's the boards who should be taking the initiative at this stage in resolving what could be potential areas of conflict between those who have, say, a compliance hat on and those who have, say, a sales hat on. So I think that needs to be thought through carefully.
I was going to link them together, actually, Jonathon, because I thought that related to the cultural comment, which I think a lot of firms are going to be struggling with how they measure.
Yeah, I mean, I entirely agree with what Jonathon said. I think I think providing, I think somebody mentioned in one of the questions actually on the chat, MI. I think providing MI to boards needs a huge amount of thought, because what the boards do not want, as we all know, is a complete, is a bible of documents they have to read before each and every board meeting. So getting that information in an intelligible form that both informs and protects the board is going to be quite a challenge, actually. Just going back to how do we know, or how will people know? I think Geoff's right. There needs to be a process in place. But let's face it, there are plenty of products that we have experience of where if you sat back and thought about it, you would realise they weren't appropriate. The going out and sell PPI to whoever you can sell it to. That kind of product, I think, is the those is the kind of product that the FCA is really focusing on in relation to the consumer duty. And I think if you place, if senior managers place themselves in the position of the consumer, and apply common sense, I think they'll realise whether products are providing a decent outcome or not.
We've got a number of options available on the screen, as you'll see by our last poll there, and from data providers and also from training firms that can support you and really understand how to get from A to Z on consumer duty in the short space of time that the regulator has currently made available to regulated firms there. So we've got a number of options, which is reaching out to Elephants Don't Forget, to how to quantify and produce the MI that we've been talking about, reaching out to our colleagues at Shoosmiths to get further understanding and advice on consumer duty, and I'll point you to their excellent Consumer Duty Hub on their website for indications of some really good content there, and also looking to Worksmart for SMCR as well as T&C solution there. We talked about the importance of training and competency and supporting that from a reg tech point of view, and so please indicate that option if that's available. And Geoff Abbott's training and competency, and also reviewing that approach to T&C, as well as supporting in terms of delivering training on consumer duty. And if you want to access a range of blogs and podcasts and webinars like this, please tick the last option on your screen, which will inform you and keep you up to date, and as well as keep you inspired, hopefully, like webinars like this in the future. Thank you very much for your time. I do appreciate the fact that you posted a number of questions. What the panelists have said is that they will agree to take those and answer those directly offline to you as individuals. And if we can't, we'll just join that up in an email to you all with the slide deck as well as the recording of this. This has been great. It's been lots to cram in, but hopefully that it's given you food for thought and some action steps that you can take to make this an easier and simpler journey as well. Thank you very much and have a great day.